Nathan stood in the doorway of the community center kitchen watching Elena organize donated food into neat rows on the metal shelving, her movements precise and economical. No wasted motion, no unnecessary flourish, and there was something about the way she worked that made him stop moving, made him forget he'd come in to ask about the volunteer schedule, made him just stand there watching her sort cans of soup and boxes of pasta with the same careful attention someone else might give to precious artifacts, and he realized with a strange tightness in his chest that he'd been watching her like this for weeks now, not watching her face or her body, but watching the way she existed in the world, the way she listened when people talked like every word mattered, the way she remembered names and details, the way she made the elderly volunteers feel valued, the way she never raised her voice, even when things went wrong. And he understood suddenly that what had been building in him wasn't attraction in the usual sense, wasn't about wanting to possess or impress or conquer. It was something quieter, something that felt almost like reverence, like he'd stumbled into the presence of something rare and didn't quite know what to do with the feeling. And the afternoon light coming through the high windows caught the silver threads in her dark hair as she reached up to place a box on a high shelf. And Nathan felt his breath catch, not because she was beautiful, though she was, but because there was something in her careful competence, in her quiet dignity, that made him want to be better, want to be someone worthy of her time. And the feeling scared him because he was 24 years old and she was probably in her mid-50s, and nothing about this made sense. But sense seemed less important than the steady pull he felt toward her presence, toward her calm, toward whatever it was that made her different from every woman he'd ever met. Before I continue, hit subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Nathan had started volunteering at the Riverside Community Center 3 months earlier, had signed up as part of a requirement for his social work degree, but had kept coming back long after he fulfilled his mandatory hours, kept showing up on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons to help sort donations, pack food boxes for seniors, organize the clothing exchange, and he'd told himself it was because the work mattered, because he believed in the mission. But if he was honest, really honest, it was because Elena was always there, steady and present, moving through the chaos of the understaffed nonprofit with a grace that made everything feel manageable. And he'd started paying attention to her without meaning to, had started noticing small things, the way she remembered which volunteers took sugar in their coffee and which didn't, the way she knew all the regular clients by name and asked about their grandchildren and their doctor's appointments, the way she deflected praise when someone thanked her but accepted it for the other volunteers, always redirecting credit, always making other people feel seen. And Nathan had worked. Enough places had met enough people to know this wasn't performance, wasn't strategy. This was just who she was. Someone whose first instinct was generosity, whose default setting was kindness, and he'd found himself thinking about her at odd moments, wondering about her life, what had shaped her into this person who moved through the world with such gentle certainty. Elena had noticed Nathan too, though she tried not to, tried to treat him the same as any other volunteer, professional and friendly, but not too friendly, because she'd learned over the years to be careful with boundaries, to maintain appropriate distance, especially with the younger volunteers who sometimes developed crushes that made everything awkward. And at 56 years old, she'd become expert at deflecting attention, at making herself invisible in plain sight, at being helpful without being memorable. And it had worked fine for years, had kept her safe, had let her do her work without complication. But Nathan was different somehow, was harder to ignore, not because he was conventionally handsome, though he was with his dark eyes and quiet manner, but because of the way he paid attention, the way he seemed to actually see the work rather than just doing it, the way he asked thoughtful questions and listened to the answers, the way he treated the elderly clients with genuine respect rather than patronizing cheerfulness. And she'd caught herself watching him sometimes, had noticed how patient he was with Mr. Chen, who moved slowly and forgot things, how he always volunteered for the heavy lifting without being asked, how he stayed late to finish tasks that weren't technically his responsibility, and she'd felt something stir that she thought was long dormant, some capacity for noticing someone, for being curious about someone, and it made her uncomfortable because she'd worked hard to build a life that didn't include those kinds, that of feelings, that didn't leave room for the vulnerability that came with letting someone matter. The community center occupied a converted warehouse in a neighborhood that had been forgotten by the city's recent revitalization efforts, all the grant money and investment flowing to the downtown corridors, while places like this stayed shabby and underfunded. And Elena had been the program director for 8 years, had watched the neighborhood change, had fought for every dollar in their budget, had learned to stretch resources and beg for donations and make you hungry. Miracles happen with expired grants and volunteer labor, and the work exhausted her, but also gave her purpose, gave her somewhere to put all the love she'd accumulated with no clear recipient, gave her a way to matter. And she'd built a life around that mattering, had made peace with being alone, had convinced herself that partnership and romance were for other people, younger people, people who still believed in fairy tales. And she'd been fine with that belief until Nathan started showing up regularly, started being present in a way that made her aware of her own loneliness, made her notice the absence in her carefully constructed life, and she resented him a little for that, disturbing her equilibrium, for making her feel something she hadn't invited. Nathan's interest in Elena had started abstractly, had begun as professional admiration, as respect for someone who did difficult work with limited resources, but it had shifted gradually into something more personal. And the shift had happened so slowly he hadn't noticed until he was already deep in it, until he was looking forward to Tuesdays and Thursdays with an anticipation that felt disproportionate to the actual work, and he'd started finding excuses to ask her questions, to be in whatever room she was in, to hear her voice. And she had this way of speaking that was soft but clear. No hedging, no apologizing, just calm directness. And oh, he loved that about her. Loved that she didn't perform femininity the way younger women often did. Didn't make herself smaller or softer or more accommodating than she actually was. She just existed as herself, solid and real, and he found that incredibly attractive, even though he knew he shouldn't. Knew there was an age gap that would make people judge. Knew she probably saw him as a kid. Knew that whatever he was feeling was probably one-sided and inappropriate and destined to go nowhere. But he couldn't make himself stop feeling it. Couldn't make himself stop wanting to be near her. Couldn't make himself stop noticing everything about her. One afternoon in late September, Nathan was helping Elena inventory the supply closet, both of them, on ladders counting boxes of donated school supplies. And she was reading numbers from labels while He recorded them on a clipboard, and at some point she laughed at something, some absurd discrepancy in the count, and Nathan turned to look at her and saw her smile for the first time. Really saw. Not the polite professional smile she wore like armor, but a real smile that transformed her entire face, made her eyes crinkle, made her look younger and more vulnerable, made her look like someone who knew joy. And he felt something crack open in his chest, felt the abstract admiration crystallize into something sharper, something that felt dangerously close to falling. And he must have been staring because she noticed, caught his gaze, and the smile faded, replaced by something careful, something guarded. And she said, "What?" And Nathan said nothing. I haven't seen you smile like that before." And Elena said, "I smile." And Nathan said, "Not like that, not like you mean it." And Elena turned back to the boxes and said we should finish the inventory. And Nathan said, "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable." And Elena said, "You didn't," but her voice said otherwise. Said he'd crossed some invisible line, and they finished the work in silence that felt heavier than it should. And when they climbed down from the ladders, Nathan wanted to apologize again, but didn't know what to apologize for noticing her, for saying so, for feeling something he shouldn't feel. Elena went home that evening to her small apartment that overlooked a park. Same apartment she'd lived in for 12 years, ever since the divorce had been finalized, and she'd needed somewhere affordable and anonymous, somewhere she could rebuild herself away from the ruins of her marriage. And she made tea and sat by the window and tried not to think about the way Nathan had looked at her, way his expression had shifted when she'd smiled, the way it had felt to be seen, like that, really seen, not assessed or judged, but simply witnessed. And she told herself firmly that she was reading too much into it, that he was young and probably surprised to see his boss being human, that it meant nothing. She needed to be more careful about maintaining professional boundaries. But even as she thought these things, she could feel the lie in them, could feel the truth, underneath which was that she'd felt something when he looked at her like that, had felt seen and scared and alive in a way she hadn't felt in years. And the feeling was dangerous, was exactly what she'd been trying to avoid. And she resolved to be more careful, to maintain more distance, to protect them both from whatever this was that seemed to be building, despite her best efforts to prevent it. Nathan couldn't sleep that night, kept replaying the moment in the supply closet, kept seeing Elena's smile, kept feeling the weight of her attention when she'd caught him staring. And he knew he needed to be normal around her, needed to stop being weird, needed to treat her like any other colleague. But the knowing didn't help, didn't change the fact that he'd crossed some internal threshold and couldn't uncross. It didn't change the fact that he was thinking about her in ways that felt inappropriate given their age difference, given their professional relationship, given everything. And he'd had crushes before, had been infatuated with teachers, and older women had gone through that phase like most guys. But this felt different, felt less like attraction, and more like recognition, like he'd been waiting his whole life to meet someone who moved through the world the way Elena did, with that particular combination of strength and gentleness, with that capacity for seeing people clearly and treating them with dignity. And he wondered if that made him weird, if normal 24-year-olds were attracted to quiet competence and emotional maturity, if his friends would laugh at him, if they knew he was hung up on a woman in her 50s who probably didn't think about him at all outside of work. The following week, Elena was more distant, more formal, called him Mr. Torres instead of Nathan, assigned him tasks that kept him in different rooms, and Nathan felt the shift like a physical thing, like she'd moved away, even though they were still in the same building, and he wanted to ask what he'd done wrong, wanted to apologize, wanted to fix whatever he'd broken. But he didn't know how to do that without making everything worse, without confirming whatever she'd decided about him. And he threw himself into work, stayed busy, helped everyone else, tried to be useful, tried be the kind of volunteer she could respect, even if she didn't want to be around him. And by Thursday afternoon he was exhausted and frustrated and considering quitting, considering removing himself from the situation entirely, because clearly his presence was making her uncomfortable, and that was the last thing he wanted. And he was packing up to leave early when Mrs. Patterson, one of the regular clients, called his name from across the room. Said, "Nathan, dear, could you help me with something?" And he went over, and she said, "Elena's in her office, and I think something's wrong." She looked upset, and Nathan said, "I'm sure she's fine." And Mrs. Patterson said, "Please, just check on her. I've known that girl for years, and I know when something's wrong." Nathan knocked on Elena's office door, a converted storage room with a desk and filing cabinets and inspirational posters about teamwork and perseverance, and heard her say, "Come in." And when he entered, she was sitting at her desk staring at her computer screen with tears running down her face. And Nathan said, "What happened?" And Elena wiped her face quickly and said, "It's nothing. I'm fine." And Nathan said, "You're clearly not fine." And Elena said, "The grant we applied for, the one for the senior meal program, we didn't get it." And Nathan said, "I'm sorry." And Elena said, "We needed that money. We were counting on it. Without it, we'll have to cut services. We'll have to turn people away." And her voice broke, and she put her face in her hands. And Nathan stood there frozen, not knowing what to do, not knowing if comfort would be welcome. And finally he said, "Can I do anything?" And Elena said, "No, there's nothing to do. I just need a minute." And Nathan said, "Okay." And he started to leave but stopped and said, "For what it's worth, you do incredible work here. You help so many people. And one grant doesn't change that." And Elena looked up at him with red eyes and said, "It changes it for the people we'll have to turn away." And Nathan said, "Then we'll find another way. We'll figure it out." And Elena said, "We." And Nathan said, "Yes, we. I'm not just here to fulfill volunteer hours. I'm here because I believe in this work, because I believe in what you're doing, and I'll help however I can." And Elena held his gaze for a long moment and said, "Thank you." And Nathan said, "Anytime." And he left, feeling like something had shifted again, like maybe the distance she'd created had narrowed slightly. Nathan spent the weekend researching grants, looking for alternative funding sources, teaching himself about nonprofit finance. And on Monday, he showed up at the center with a folder full of printouts, potential grants they could apply for, local businesses they could approach for sponsorship, fundraising, ideas they could implement quickly. And he found Elena in the kitchen and said, "I know this is probably overstepping, but I thought maybe these could help." And he handed her the folder, and she opened it and looked through the pages, and her expression shifted from surprise to something softer, something that looked almost like gratitude. And she said, you did all this research. And Nathan said, it's not much, just some ideas. And Elena said, it's not nothing. And Nathan said, I meant what? I said, about wanting to help. And Elena looked at him and said, why? And Nathan said, what do you mean? And Elena said, why do you care so much? You fulfilled your volunteer requirement months ago. Don't owe us anything. And Nathan said, I don't do it because I owe you. I do it because it matters, because you matter. And the words hung in the air between them. Too honest, too revealing. And Elena's expression shuddered, and she said, thank you for the research. I'll look through it. And Nathan said, okay. And he left feeling like he'd said too much again, like he kept pushing against boundaries she was trying to maintain, but he couldn't help it. Couldn't help being honest with her. Could help wanting her to know that she was valued, that her work was important, that she mattered. Elena looked through Nathan's research that evening, read every page carefully, and felt something complicated happening in her chest, something that felt like the walls she'd built starting to crack. And she told herself to be careful, told herself that Nathan was young and earnest, and didn't understand what he was offering, didn't understand the complications that came with his attention. But the research was good, was actually useful, showed real thought and effort, showed that he'd spent hours trying to help her, trying to solve her problem. And nobody had done something like that for her in so long. She'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone care about her struggles, have someone want to make her life easier. And she let herself feel grateful, let herself feel touched, let herself acknowledge that maybe Nathan's attention wasn't just a crush. Maybe it was something more genuine, more rooted in who she actually was rather than some fantasy. And that thought scared her even more than the alternative, because if he was seeing her clearly and still, choosing to care then, she had to take him seriously, had to consider what she wanted, had to decide if she was brave enough to let something happen. The community center organized a fundraising event in October, a dinner and silent auction. And Elena was running herself ragged, trying to coordinate everything. And Nathan watched her stretch herself thinner and thinner, watched her skip meals and stay late and take on too much. And finally he said, Elena, you need help. You can't do this all yourself. And Elena said, I'm fine. And Nathan said, you're not fine. You're exhausted. Let me help. And Elena said, you already help. And Nathan said, let me help more. Give me real responsibility. Treat me like staff instead of a volunteer. And Elena said, I can't pay. You? And Nathan said, I don't want to be paid. I want to help. And Elena looked at him and said, why are you doing this? And Nathan said, because someone should take care of you for a change. And Elena said, I don't need taking care of. And Nathan said, everyone needs taking care of sometimes. Even people who spend their whole lives taking care of everyone else. And Elena felt something break inside her, some defense she'd been maintaining. And she said, okay, I could use help with the auction items. I need someone to coordinate pickup and display. And Nathan said, I'll do it. Just tell me what you need. And Elena said, thank you. And Nathan said, you don't have to thank me. And Elena said, yes, I do. Not enough people say thank you to you. And Nathan said, then we're even. Working closely with Nathan on the fundraiser meant Elena couldn't maintain her distance, meant they were together constantly, planning and coordinating and problem solving. And she found herself relaxing around him, despite her better judgment, found herself laughing at his jokes, accepting his help, letting him see her when she was stressed and tired and not at her best, and he was good at the work, was organized and thoughtful, and handled crisis with calm competence. And she caught herself thinking he'd be good at this job, if he wanted it, if he chose work in nonprofits instead of whatever else his degree might lead to. And she caught herself thinking other things too, noticing things she'd been trying not to notice. The way his hands moved when he assembled display tables, the way he listened when she talked, the way he anticipated her needs before she voiced them, the way he made her feel capable and valued and seen. And it had been so long since anyone had made her feel that way, had been so long since she'd let anyone close enough to try. And she found herself looking forward to their planning sessions, found herself disappointed when he had to leave, found herself thinking about him at night in ways that felt inappropriate, but that she couldn't quite stop. Nathan knew he was in deeper than he should be, knew he was developing feelings, went beyond professional respect or friendship, knew he was falling for Elena in ways that complicated everything. But he couldn't make himself care about the complications, couldn't make himself worry about the age difference, or what people might think, or whether she could ever feel the same way. All he could think about was how much he wanted to be near her, how much he wanted to make her life easier, how much he wanted to be someone she could count on. And he knew that made him sound young and naive and like he didn't understand how the world worked. But maybe he didn't care about understanding. Maybe he just wanted to feel what he was feeling, wanted to let himself care about someone without overthinking it, wanted to trust that what he felt was real even if it didn't make conventional sense. And every time he was with Elena, every time he saw her smile, or heard her laugh, or watched her solve some impossible problem with limited resources, he felt more certain that what he felt wasn't a phase, or a crush, or some misplaced admiration. It was something real, something that felt like the beginning of love, and that terrified him, but also felt inevitable, felt like something he'd been moving toward his whole life without knowing it. The fundraiser was a success, raised more money than Elena had hoped for, enough to cover the gap left by the denied grant. And at the end of the evening, after the last guests had left and the volunteers had gone home, Elena and Nathan sat in the empty event space, surrounded by folded tables and scattered auction cards, both of them exhausted. And Elena said, "We did it." And Nathan said, "You did it. I just helped." And Elena said, "Don't diminish your contribution. You made this happen." And Nathan said, "We made it happen together." And Elena looked at him in the dim light of the overhead fixtures and said, "Thank you. Seriously, I couldn't have done this without you." And Nathan said, "You probably could have, but I'm glad you did have to." And Elena said, "Nathan." And Nathan said, "Yes." And Elena said, "I need to tell you something." And Nathan felt his heart speed up and said, "Okay." And Elena said, "I've been trying to keep my distance from you." And Nathan said, I noticed. Elena said, I was trying to be professional, trying to maintain boundaries, but I don't think I can anymore. And Nathan said, why not? And Elena said, because you keep showing up, keep being exactly who you are, keep making me feel things I thought I was done feeling. And Nathan said, what things? And Elena said, cared for, valued, seen. And Nathan said, you are all those things. And Elena said, I'm also old enough to be your mother. And Nathan said, you're not my mother. You're Elena. And Elena said the age difference matters. And Nathan said, why? And Elena said, because people will judge. Because I don't want you to wake up one day and realize you wasted your youth on someone old, because I'm scared. And Nathan said, I'm scared too, but I'd rather be scared with you than safe without you. And Elena said, you don't know what you're saying. And Nathan said, yes, I do. I've known for months. I've been trying to figure out how to tell you, trying to find the right words. And Elena said, there are no right words for this. And Nathan said, then maybe we don't need words. And he reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hand. And Elena felt the touch like electricity, felt every reason she should pull away, collapsing under the weight of how much she wanted to stay. She didn't pull away, just sat there holding his hand in the empty room with tears running down her face. And Nathan said, why are you crying? And Elena said, because I didn't think I was allowed to feel this way anymore. Because I thought this part of my life was over. Because you're making me hope, and hope is terrifying. They sat like that for a long time, hands linked, not talking, just existing together in the space between what was and what might be. And finally, Elena said we should talk about this somewhere else. Not here. And Nathan said, okay. When? And Elena said, tomorrow. Come to my apartment tomorrow afternoon. We'll talk properly. And Nathan said, okay. And Elena said, I can't promise you anything. And Nathan said, I'm not asking for promises. And Elena said, what are you asking for? And Nathan said, just a chance. Just the possibility of this being something. And Elena said, okay, we can talk about possibility. And they left the event space separately. Elena first and Nathan a few minutes later, both of them trying to maintain the appearance of professionalism, even though everything had changed. And Nathan walked home through the October night, feeling like his chest might burst, feeling like he'd just stepped off a cliff and didn't know if he was flying or falling. And Elena drove home, gripping her steering wheel with shaking hands, thinking about tomorrow, about what she'd say, about whether she was brave enough to let this happen, about whether she could protect them both from the judgment and complications that would inevitably come. And when she got home, she stood at her window looking out at the dark park and let herself imagine what it might feel like to be with Nathan, really be with him, to let him care for her the way he clearly wanted to let herself care for him the way she already did. And the thought filled her with equal parts terror and longing. Nathan arrived at Elena's apartment the next afternoon with a bottle of wine he'd agonized over in the store. Not sure if wine was too romantic or if nothing was too casual, and Elena opened the door in jeans and a sweater, her hair down instead of pulled back, looking more relaxed than he'd ever seen her. And she said, come in. And he followed her into the small space that was neat and carefully decorated, books everywhere, plants on every surface, photographs on the walls of places he didn't recognize. And she said, I made coffee. Or we could have the wine. And Nathan said, coffee's good. And they sat at her kitchen table with mugs between them. And for a long moment neither of them spoke. And finally Elena said, I don't know how to do this. And Nathan said, neither do I. And Elena said, I haven't dated anyone in 8 years, haven't wanted to. And Nathan said, why not? And Elena said, because my marriage ended. Badly, because I decided it was easier to be alone, because I stopped believing in this, in connection, in the possibility of finding someone who saw me. And Nathan said, and now? And Elena said, and now you've disrupted that belief. And Nathan said, is that bad? And Elena said, I don't know. Ask me again in a year. And Nathan said, I will. I'll ask you every year for as long as you'll let me. And Elena smiled and said, you're very sure of yourself. And Nathan said, I'm not sure of anything except how I feel about you. And Elena said, how do you feel about me? And Nathan said, I feel like you're the most remarkable person I've ever met. I feel like every time I'm around you, I want to be better. I feel like your inner beauty moved me long before I noticed how beautiful you are on the outside. And Elena said, that's the nicest thing anyone has ever said to me. And Nathan said, then people haven't been paying attention. Elena told Nathan about her marriage that afternoon, about how she'd met her ex-husband at 25, had married, and him at 27, had spent 26 years building a life around his career. His needs, his priorities, had made herself smaller and smaller to fit into his vision of what a wife should be, and how eventually he'd left anyway, had told her she was boring, that they'd grown apart, that he needed more excitement in his life, and how that rejection had broken something in her, had made her question everything about who she was and what she had to offer. And Nathan listened without interrupting. And when she finished, he said, he was wrong. You're not boring. You're the opposite of boring. You're someone who actually lives their values, who actually shows up for people. And that's rare. That's extraordinary. And Elena said, I don't feel extraordinary. I feel ordinary and tired, and like I don't know what I'm doing. And Nathan said, that's how most people feel. The difference is you keep showing up anyway. And Elena said, is that what you see in me, consistency, because that doesn't sound very romantic. And Nathan said, I see someone who knows who she is, who treats people with dignity, who creates beauty and stability in a chaotic world. And yes, that's romantic. That's incredibly romantic. And Elena felt something loosen in her chest, some knot of inadequacy she'd been carrying since the divorce. And she said, you're very kind. And Nathan said, I'm not being kind. I'm being honest. And Elena said, those aren't mutually exclusive. And Nathan said, no. But I need you to know I'm not saying these things to make you feel better. I'm saying them because they're true. And Elena said, okay, I'll try to believe that. Nathan told Elena about his family, about growing up with a single mother who'd worked 2 jobs to keep them housed and fed, about watching her sacrifice everything for him and his sister, about learning from her that love was action, was showing up, was doing the work even when you were tired. And he said, that's what I see in you, that same quality my mother had, that same capacity for caring without making it about yourself. And Elena said, that's a lovely comparison. And Nathan said, she would have liked you. And Elena said, would have. And Nathan said, she died 2 years ago, cancer. And Elena said, I'm sorry. And Nathan said, me too. I think about her every day. Think about what she taught me. Think about how she never complained, even when things were hard. And Elena said, she sounds remarkable. And Nathan said she was. She taught me that age doesn't matter. That connection doesn't follow rules. That love is about recognizing someone, about seeing them clearly and choosing them anyway. And Elena said, is that what you're doing? Choosing me. And Nathan said, yes, if you'll let me, and Elena said, I'm scared. And Nathan said, me too. But Elena said, no, don't understand. I'm scared of hurting you, of taking something from you, of you waking up in 5 years and resenting me for the time you spent. And Nathan said I could get hit by a bus tomorrow. We could both get hit by a bus. Nobody gets guarantees. And Elena said that's not comforting. And Nathan said it's not meant to be comforting. It's meant to be true. All we have is now, this moment, this choice to take a risk on something that feels real. And Elena said, what if it doesn't work? And Nathan said, what if it does? They talked until evening, until the light faded and Elena turned on lamps, until coffee turned to wine, until the distance between them at the table had somehow shrunk, and at some point Nathan reached across and took Elena's hand again, and Elena let him. Let herself feel the warmth of his touch. Let herself imagine what it might be like to let this develop into something real. And she said people will judge us, and Nathan said let them. And Elena said they'll say, I'm taking advantage of you. And Nathan said, I'm an adult. I can make my own choices. And Elena said they'll say you're going through a phase. Nathan said they don't know me. They don't know you. They don't know this. And Elena said, I need you to be sure, really sure. Because if we do this, I can't be casual about it. I can't do the thing where we date and it doesn't work out, and we just move on. I'm too old for that. And Nathan said, I'm not asking for casual, I'm asking for real. And Elena said real is complicated. And Nathan said everything worthwhile and is complicated. And Elena said, okay, but we go slow. We figure this out as we go. And Nathan said as slow as you need. And Elena said, and you have to promise to tell me if you change your mind. If you wake up one day and realize this isn't what you want. And Nathan said, I promise. But I won't. And Elena said, you can't know that. And Nathan said, I know how I feel. And Elena said, feelings change. And Nathan said, not these feelings, not for me. And Elena said, you're very certain for someone so young. And Nathan said, I learned from the best. And Elena said, who? And Nathan said, you. I learned from you. The first time they kissed was 2 weeks later, after they'd spent every evening together, after they talked about everything, after Elena had finally allowed herself to believe that Nathan was serious, that this wasn't a passing fancy or a phase, but something real. And they were at her apartment, again had just finished dinner that Nathan had insisted on cooking, and they were washing dishes side by side. And Nathan said something that made Elena laugh, really laugh. And he turned to look at her and saw that smile again. The real one, the one that transformed her face. And he said, there it is. And Elena said, what? And Nathan said, your smile, the real one. I've been trying to make you smile like that since the day I first saw it. And Elena said, you're ridiculous. And Nathan said, probably. And Elena said, definitely. And Nathan said, I'm going to kiss you now, if that's okay. And Elena felt her heart hammering and said, okay. And Nathan leaned in slowly, giving her time to change her mind, and kissed her gently, carefully, like she was something precious. And Elena felt everything stop, felt time suspend, felt every defense she'd built over the last 8 years crumble completely. And when they pulled apart, she was crying. And Nathan said, why are you crying? And Elena said, because I didn't think I'd ever feel this again. Didn't think anyone would ever look at me the way you're looking at me right now. And Nathan said, how am I looking at you? And Elena said, like I matter, like I'm worth choosing. And Nathan said, you are? You're worth everything. The relationship developed slowly after that. Elena insisted on slowness, giving Nathan chances to reconsider, on maintaining some separation between their private life and their work at the community center. And Nathan was patient, was willing to move at her pace, was content to exist in whatever space she was comfortable creating. And the other volunteers noticed something, had shifted, noticed Nathan and Elena were careful around each other. In a new way, noticed the glances they exchanged when they thought no one was looking. And Mrs. Patterson said to Elena one day, "That young man is in love with you, you know." And Elena said, "That's ridiculous." And Mrs. Patterson said, "I'm 83 years old. I've seen a lot of love in my life, and that boy loves you." And Elena said, "Even if that's true, it doesn't make it less complicated." And Mrs. Patterson said, "Love is always complicated. That's what makes it worth having." And Elena said, "You sound like Nathan." And Mrs. Patterson said, "Then he's a smart young man." And Elena said, "He is. He's too smart for his own good." And Mrs. Patterson said, "Or maybe he's exactly smart enough to recognize something real when he sees it." Nathan's friends found out eventually. One of them saw Nathan and Elena together at a coffee shop, saw the way they sat close, saw the way Nathan looked at her, and the friend texted the group chat asking if Nathan was dating someone. And Nathan said yes, and his friend said, "Who?" "We want to meet her." And Nathan said, "It's complicated." And his friend said, "All relationships are complicated." And Nathan said, "She's older." And his friend said, "How much older?" And Nathan said, "Enough that people will judge." And his friend said, "So what? If you're happy, who cares what people think?" And Nathan said, "I care about protecting her, about not making her life harder." And his friend said, "Does she know you feel that way?" And Nathan said, "I think so." And his friend said, "Then trust her to make her own choices. Trust that she knows what she wants." And Nathan said, Okay, you're right." And when he told Elena about the conversation, she said, "Your friends sound wise." And Nathan said, "They are, mostly." And Elena said, "Do they know about me?" And Nathan said, "They know I'm seeing someone. They know I'm happy. They don't know details." And Elena said, "Because you're ashamed." And Nathan said, "Because I'm protective. There's a difference." And Elena said, "Thank you for that." And Nathan said, "Always." The first real crisis came in December, when they'd been together for 2 months, when Elena's ex-husband found out she was seeing someone and called her angry, said he'd heard from a mutual friend, said she was embarrassing herself, said people were talking, and Elena hung up shaking, and Nathan found her in her office at the center looking stricken. And he said, "What happened?" And Elena told him. And Nathan said, "He doesn't get an opinion on your life anymore. He gave up that right when he left." And Elena said, "I know that logically, but emotionally, it's harder." And Nathan said, "Did he say exactly?" And Elena said, "He said I was making a fool of myself, that people were laughing at me, that I should act my age." And Nathan felt anger rise hot in his throat and said, "People are small and scared and threatened by anyone who refuses to follow their rules. And you haven't done anything wrong. You haven't hurt anyone. You're just choosing happiness. And that shouldn't require anyone's permission." And Elena said, "But what if he's right? What if I am making a fool of myself?" And Nathan said, "Then we're making fools of ourselves together." And Elena said, "You're not the one people will mock. You're the younger man. People will assume you're getting something from this. But me, I'm the older woman. I'm the one they'll say is desperate, is pathetic, is clinging to youth. And Nathan said, let them say whatever they want. It doesn't change what's true. It doesn't change what we have. And Elena said, what do we have? And Nathan said, we have something real, something that makes both our lives better, something worth protecting. And Elena said, I'm just tired of fighting, tired of defending, tired of explaining. And Nathan said, then stop explaining, stop defending, just live your life. And Elena said, it's not that simple. And Nathan said, maybe it should be. They almost broke up that night. Elena convinced herself that staying together would only cause more pain, would only invite more judgment, would only make both their lives harder. And she told Nathan they should take a break, should step back, should reconsider. And Nathan said no. And Elena said, what do you mean no? And Nathan said, I mean, I'm not giving up on this because your ex-husband is a judgmental ass who can't stand to see you happy. And Elena said, it's not just him, it's everyone. And Nathan said, I don't care about everyone. I care about you. And Elena said, you're young. You don't understand how much this kind of judgment weighs. And Nathan said, you're right. I don't. But I'm willing to learn. I'm willing to stand next to you and face whatever comes. And Elena said, why? Why would you do that? And Nathan said, because I love you. And the words hung in the air between them. The first time either of them had said it directly. And Elena started crying and said, you can't love me. We've only been together 2 months. And Nathan said, I can love you however fast or slow I want. And I've loved you since before we were together, since the first day I saw you organize those food donations with the same care someone else would give to precious things. And Elena said, that's not love, that's admiration. And Nathan said it started as admiration, but it became love. Became this feeling that you're the person I want to talk to at the end of every day, became this certainty that my life is better with you in it. And Elena said, I love you too. And Nathan said then that it's enough. That's all we need. And Elena said, it's not enough. Love isn't enough. And Nathan said, then what is? And Elena said, I don't know. Courage, maybe. The courage to keep choosing this even when it's hard. And Nathan said, I have that courage. Do you? And Elena said, I'm trying to. And Nathan said, then try with me. And Elena said, okay, we'll keep trying. Christmas came, and Nathan invited Elena to meet his sister and his father. Said his family wanted to meet her, wanted to know the person who made him so happy. And Elena was terrified, convinced they'd hate her, convinced they'd see her as some predatory older woman. But when she met them, they were warm, were welcoming. And Nathan's sister pulled her aside and said, thank you. And Elena said, for what? And Nathan's sister said, for making my brother happy, for seeing how special he is. And Elena said, is special. And Nathan's sister said, we know, but not everyone sees it. And Elena said, I see it. Nathan's sister said, good. Then you're perfect for each other. And Elena felt something in her chest, ease, felt some of her fear subside. And later that evening, Nathan's father said to her, my wife was 10 years older than me. People judged us too, said it wouldn't last. And we had 35 years together before she died. 35 good years. So don't let other people's fear dictate your happiness. And Elena said, thank you for saying that. And Nathan's father said, I mean it. Age is just a number. What matters is how you treat each other. And I can see Nathan treats you well. And Elena said, he does. He's extraordinary. And Nathan's father said he gets that from his mother. And Elena said, I wish I could have met her. And Nathan's father said she would have loved you, would have recognized in you the same qualities she had, the same kindness, the same strength. And Elena cried a little, and Nathan's father hugged her and said, your family now, if you want to be. And Elena said, I want to be. The new year brought a shift in how Elena thought about their relationship. brought a willingness to stop hiding, to stop apologizing, to claim Nathan publicly as hers, and let herself be claimed by him. And when the community center held its January board meeting, Elena introduced Nathan as her partner, said it simply without fanfare or explanation. And there was a moment of silence, and then one of the board members said, "Congratulations. We're happy for you." And Elena felt surprised, felt like she'd been braced for judgment and received acceptance instead. And afterward, Nathan said, "See, people are less judgmental than you think." And Elena said, "Or maybe they just respect me enough to trust my choices." And Nathan said, "Either way, we're done hiding." And Elena said, "We're done hiding." And Nathan said, "How does that feel?" And Elena said, "Terrifying and liberating." And Nathan said, "That's how most good things feel." And Elena said, "You're very wise for someone so young." And Nathan said, "I keep telling you, age and wisdom aren't always correlated." And Elena said, "I'm learning that." And Nathan said, "Good, keep learning." And Elena said, "Teach me." And Nathan said, "I'll teach you everything I know if you teach me everything you know." And Elena said, "That's not a fair trade. I have 30 years more experience." And Nathan said, "Then I'll just have to spend the next 30 years catching up." And Elena said, "You promise?" And Nathan said, "I promise. I'll spend every year I can learning from you and teaching you and building this life with you." And Elena said, "That's all I want." And Nathan said, "Then that's what we'll do." They moved in together in March. Nathan gave up his apartment and moved into Elena's space. And they created a home together, blended their belongings and their routines and their lives in ways that felt natural and right. And Elena had been worried it would be hard, had been worried they'd discover incompatibilities. But instead, they discovered how well they fit, how Nathan's night owl tendencies complemented her early morning energy, how his chaos balanced her order, how his optimism lifted her tendency toward worry. And Nathan said, "I like living with you." And Elena said, "I like living with you too." And Nathan said, "I like that your books are everywhere. I like that you hum when you cook. I like that you leave me notes. I like everything about sharing space with you." And Elena said, "Even when I'm grumpy." And Nathan said, "Especially when you're grumpy, because even your grumpy is better than anyone else. It's cheerful." And Elena said, "You're ridiculous." And Nathan said, "You love me anyway." And Elena said, "I do. I love you anyway, and because, and despite everything." And Nathan said, "That's all I need." And Elena said, "Me too." And they stood in their kitchen, their shared kitchen, in the home they were building together. And Elena thought about how impossible this had seemed a year ago, how she'd been convinced her life was settled, was done, was just a matter of existing, until the end. And instead she'd found this, found Nathan, found a love that didn't follow rules, that didn't care about conventional expectations, that just existed as itself, pure and real and worth everything. And she said, "Thank you." And Nathan said, "For what?" And Elena said, "For seeing me, for choosing me, for being patient while I figured out how to let you in." And Nathan said, "Thank you for letting me in, for trusting me, for being brave enough to take this risk." And Elena said, "We're both brave." And Nathan said, "Yes, we are." And Elena said, "What do we do now?" And Nathan said, "Now we live, we build, we keep choosing each other every day." And Elena said, "Okay." And Nathan said, "Okay." And they stood there in the late afternoon light, holding hands, Two people who'd found each other against all odds. Two people who'd chosen love over fear. Two people who were building something beautiful and strange and completely their own. And Elena smiled, that real smile, the one that had captured Nathan's attention all those months ago. And Nathan smiled back, and they existed together in that moment, in the life they were creating, in the love they'd found. And it was enough. It was everything. It was more than either of them had dared to hope for, and they were grateful, and they were home.